In today's video, I have the perfect opportunity to talk about the function called List.Accumulate. I'm sure you must have heard of this function, List.Accumulate in Power Query. Really powerful. And I would like to demonstrate how this function works to you and use the problem that I gave you in Power Query to talk about its capabilities and how can you use this function. Now, in order for me to structure this entire video, I'll straight away jump into List.Accumulate, talk about simple examples, talk about complicated examples. I will also talk about the solution to our problem using List.Accumulate. And in case you believe that it's too complicated, we'll also talk about a simple solution to solve the same problem. All right, no further ado, let's get started. All right, before I start to delve deep into examples of List.Accumulate, it's very important to understand the syntax of List.Accumulate. What do you write inside of that function? What does the function do? What do you get as an output of the function? And once we have covered a bit of theory, we'll actually take a look at a few good practical examples. Please take a look. The List.Accumulate function, as the first part, asks you for a list. And List.Accumulate function is an iterator function. It can go loop through every single item of the list and can accumulate the result over the next item. What do I mean by that? I'll just help you understand. So let's just say that we declare a particular list. And if you don't know what a list is nothing but a single columnar data structure in Power Query that can hold just one column but perhaps multiple rows. So let's just say that we have a list, and in the list we have a couple of items that we have to iterate through. Now the List.Accumulate function, what it's going to do is it's actually going to take the first item and do something with that particular item. It could be anything. Now once that something has been done, it is going to take the result of the first step and accumulate that over the iteration of the second step. Now, once it's done with the second step, then it is going to take the result of the first two steps and accumulate that over the third step, and so on and so forth. That's how the List.Accumulate function works. Not only there is an iteration, but there is also an accumulation of all the previous step, putting together into the current step in the iteration. All right. The next input that you happen to write in the List.Accumulate is the seed or the starting point. Now I'm happening to use a lot of English terminologies just to help you understand, right? So what is a seed? Seed simply means that when you're trying to do your accumulation, what is your starting point? Do you want to start with something blank? Do you want to start with zero? Do you want to start with a certain table? Whatever you would want to start with, that is nothing but your starting point. Now note that in the List.Accumulate function, the starting point could be anything. It could be a number, it could be a text, it could be a list, it could be a table, it could literally be anything. All right. Now, when you start to write List.Accumulate, you happen to declare two variables. One is the state variable, the other one is a current variable. What do I mean by these state and current variables? Please take a look. Let's just say that I happen to define a list and the list has got three items, right? Every single item of this particular list is going to be as a current. So when the list goes through an iteration, now there are obviously going to be three iterations, iteration number 1, iteration number 2, and iteration number 3. In the first iteration, the first item is going to be denoted by current. When the iteration happens for the second time, then the second item is going to take the place of the current, and finally this becomes current at the third time. So current is nothing but the current item of the list that you have declared. All right. Now what exactly is the state? State is nothing but the output of every single iteration. Now, if you have taken maybe classes in accounting and finance, it's very easy to understand what is the closing balance. So imagine that something like I am doing an iteration over three items and the iteration produces a result, right? This is my result. This result, which is the output of the first iteration, is nothing but the state. Now, this is nothing but the closing balance, right? The closing balance happens to be the opening balance of the next step. And then something again happens, then you again get the result. This is again the state, which is the output of the second step, which is nothing like a closing balance. And the closing balance happens to be the opening balance of the next, maybe iteration. Then this actually becomes the state. And finally, once all the iterations are complete, the state happens to be the output, which is the output of the final iteration. The accumulated result happens to be the output. The beauty of List.Accumulate function is that the output can be a table, it can be a list, it can be a single number, and that is what makes the function absolutely magical to work with. Now, enough talking. We have done a bit of theory. I'm not really sure if you've understood anything. I hopefully will be able to help you understand with a lot more practical examples. So let's just jump over to example and let's have fun with this function. All right, in Power Query here, and let's just start to work with a ridiculously simple example to put the concepts into play, talking about List.Accumulate right from scratch. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to declare a list, and the list is going to have 3 letters A, B, and C. Let's just start with that. So in the source step, I'm just going to start writing equals to a list, and list obviously is going to be defined in the curly brackets. I'm just going to say that the first item is A, the second item is B, and the third item is C. Now, once I commit to this, I'm going to get a list, and that is the list that I would want to iterate through. What is it that I'm trying to achieve as an output through List.Accumulate is nothing but the concatenation of the 3 letters that I have. That means as an output, I would like to get A concatenated with B, concatenated with C. This is what I would want to see as an output. Now, sure enough, there are several ways to do it, but I'm going to try to explain List.Accumulate through the concatenation example. All right. Now, the next thing that I'm going to do is insert a new step, and in this particular step, I'm going to start writing List.Accumulate. So I'm just going to say List.Accumulate as the first part of the List.Accumulate function. If you remember, the first part is nothing but the list. That means which list do you want to iterate through? So take a look. It's also asking you that, hey, do you have a list that you would want to iterate through? Sure enough, we do have that list, and that was the list that we declared on the first step, which was containing the 3 letters, and that has been defined as nothing but my source. So I'm just going to feed my source step right here, and I'm good to go with that first part. The next input in the List.Accumulate function is the seed, or your starting point. That means how would you like to start? Now, for just a second, let's just try to imagine the output that we're trying to achieve. We are trying to achieve A concatenated with B concatenated with C. But if I want to have this particular output and concatenate all the 3 items together, what do I want to start with? That means, do I want something particular at the start here at the concatenation? The answer is no. So I'm saying that, hey, why don't you start with a blank string? Nothing, just like 2 quotation marks, and that's what you start with, right? Now, I'm going to say that, hey, then it says that what's your accumulator function? How would you want to accumulate items in that list? Now, if you remember that we had 2 variables that we would want to declare. So if I open the bracket right here, I'm going to say that the first variable is state and the second variable is a current. Now note that state and current variables could also be named something else. So you could just call it hello and hello2, and this is also going to work just fine. Note that the position of the variable decides what is going to be the input of the variable. Whatever you write here as a variable, whatever name, is going to be the output of the step. Whatever you write here is going to be every single item of this particular list. So the word state and current is just a common practice that everybody follows. Should you want to follow this practice, you can follow it. In case you don't want to follow it, that's totally okay. So I'm going to declare 2 variables. One is the state, the other one is the current, and I'm going to convert this into a function. Now, it's time for me to write a certain function that concatenates every single item and then combines it. So how do we do such a thing? Imagine that we have this particular list. I mean, you don't have to imagine, we really have that list. So we have A, B, and C, and I'd like to concatenate every single item. Now, as a fact, you already understand that List.Accumulate is nothing but an iterator function. That means it is going to go through the first row, then it is going to go through the second row, then it is going to go through the third row. That is the property of List.Accumulate, right? So what do I want to do? In the first row, I start with nothing. So nothing is my like a blank string. And then I say that, hey, why don't you pick up A and concatenate that. So I'm just going to say that my starting point is nothing, and I'm just concatenating that with the current, because current happens to be the first value that the current is going to store, because in the iteration A happens to be the first input. So A is going to be denoted right here. Now what is going to be the output here? So nothing combined with the current is nothing but A, so you're going to get A as an output. Now once A becomes the output of the first step, that particular A value is now going to be stored in the state variable right here. Now once that particular value has been stored in the state variable, then that becomes your starting point. So I'm just saying, hey, why don't you take your A and concatenate again that with current. So curr is nothing but current. And then now the output is going to be A concatenated with B, and this is going to be your input or output of the second step and input of the third step, and then so on and so forth. So I just have to write something like, hey, take the state and concatenate that with the current, and that's about it. Now if we commit to this, I'm going to get concatenated A, B, and C, and I hope that you understood that how the concatenation was happening through the 3 stages of accumulation and iteration in that list. All right, let's just start with example number 2, still very simple, and then we'll graduate to a more complicated example. All right, fellas, example number 2. We have already created a simple list which contains 5 numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to square every single number and then sum the result. What do I want? So 1 square is 1, 2 square is 4, 3 square is 9, 4 square is 16, and 5 square is 25. Once I get the squares of every single number, I then want to sum it up and the answer is going to be 55. That's what I would want to see as a result. The number 55 is what I'd like to see. How do we do such a thing through List.Accumulate? Now, let's just start. So I'm just going to maybe create a new step and start to write List.Accumulate. So I'm just going to say, hey, List.Accumulate. And I think I made a spelling error. All right, List.Accumulate. The first part, it's asking you, hey, do you have a list that you would like to accumulate through? Sure enough, I have created the list, and the name of that list is nothing but the first step, which is nothing but my source. I'm just going to feed the source step right in here. Then it says, hey, do you want to maybe start as a seed? That means what's your starting point? Now, note that at this particular stage, I am trying to perform arithmetic on numbers, and my starting point cannot be like a text as we had it before, because we were working with text values now. Now, once you're trying to start and we have the 5 numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, my starting point could be 0, because if I add something to 0, it's going to be just fine. So my starting point is just 0. So I can just write that 0 happens to be my starting point. Then it asks me, hey, what's your accumulator? And this is where we have to declare the 2 variables, the state and the current. Now, just for a change, I'm now going to call these variables as state and current. I'm going to call something else, and you will see they actually mean the same thing, even if you change the name state and current to something else. So just for fun, I'm going to call this as S, and the other one is that I'm going to call it as C, just to help you understand that S is state and C is current. All right, now let's just call the function. So I'm just going to maybe write the accumulator function. Now, what I have to now close down on is decide that how is the function going to happen and how is the accumulation going to happen at every single place. Now let's just go back to the basics and start to work out our logic. If you take a look at this particular list right here in the first step, we have 5 numbers. Now, once the iteration starts, the first item is going to be 1. That means 1 happens to be my current, right? So what is going to happen is that I would want to take the current and multiply it with current once again. So current into current is going to give me the square. This is again going to give me the square. This is again going to give me the square. So current into current. So if I write current into current, it's actually going to give me the square. But the problem is that I'm not really doing the state anywhere. That means once the multiplication has been done, this particular result needs to be added to the second iteration, and this particular result needs to be added to the third iteration. So what do? Now I know that the result of every single step is stored in the variable called state. I can write something like this. Hey, take this current into current and plus what? Plus the state, which is nothing but the output of every single step. Easy enough. So I'm just going to come right here. And as a function, you always write how the values are going to get accumulated. So I'm just going to say, hey, first of all, I would want you to take the state, not state, but S this time, because we declared S. So S plus, and I'm just going to say C multiplied by C, and that is nothing but my square. Hopefully this should work. I just close the bracket and press enter, and that gives me the 55 answer that I was looking for. Awesome. All right, let's just start to work with a real example to solve problems using List.Accumulate. Now, this is the problem that I gave you in the last video. There are many ways to solve this problem, but I will take the opportunity of explaining you how does List.Accumulate function work on this particular type of the problem. Please take a look. Just a quick recap of the problem. We have names of people and we have different training programs that these people have done. And I would like to create a column for every single training program. That means that my son Rehat here has done 2 training programs. One is Power Query, the other one is Excel. So I'm just going to build 2 columns right here. One is going to be Power Query, the other one is going to be Excel, and I will mark true and true. And there are going to be other columns as well. So there's going to be a trading column, a fashion column. So all of the training programs here are going to have a column, and whosoever has done whatever training is going to be marked as true. So for example, CJ has done trading, it's going to be marked as true against in that column. So how do we do such a thing using List.Accumulate? Let's just do some bit of manual work, try to understand the code that gets generated and take a look at, does it match the behavior of List.Accumulate or not? So real quick, I'm going to add a manual column. So I'm just going to go to the add columns tab, custom column. I'm just going to say, hey, why don't we create a manual column called Power Query? And in that column, just for making things work, we'll just write 1 for now. Let's just be done with that. I'm just going to say Power Query, and this is the column that is created. I'm going to go back to add columns tab and create one more column. I'm just going to say this is going to be Excel, and again 1 right here, say okay, and that's the column that has been created. Now, if you closely take a look at the syntax, it clearly matches the pattern of list.accumulate. Please take a look. If I go back to the first column that we added, in the table.add column function that was generated, there were three critical parts. The first part was, hey, in which table would you like to add a column? So I'm saying, hey, the source step, which contained only 2 columns, please add a new column. What is the name of the column? That's the second part. Is the name of the column is Power Query. And what's the third part? It's some formula that is going to generate true and false. Right now, this is 1. Pretty good. Now, take a look at the next one. On the table, which was already generated, we accumulate the next table. That means on top of this table, we are going to take that table as the input or the state, and we are going to accumulate one more column. So take a look. In this particular step, the table that we are trying to use is nothing but the previous step table. That means we are trying to accumulate one more column on the previous step. The name of the column is Excel and the value of that column is 1 in this case. Now, it clearly qualifies for the behavior of list.accumulate because we are trying to accumulate the table of the previous step and add a new column on top of that, add a new column on top of that. That is pretty well. So what do we do is we first have to take all of these training programs which are going to be added as a column in a form of a list. And once we're able to extract all these training programs in a form of a list, then we'll be able to work with list.accumulate in a good way. So that's the first part. Let's just get done with that. All right, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this particular query to be able to convert all of these training programs into a list. Right click on the data query. I'm just going to say duplicate and I get one more query right here. I'm going to call this as training list. So training list. Good to go. Now from this particular table, I don't really need the name column in here. I just need the training column in here. So I'm just going to create a new step and I'm going to say that, hey, please extract the training column from this particular table. Table name, column name in the square bracket is going to give you what? A list. If I now commit to this, I have got the list. However, the problem is that Power Query, Excel is not really the kind of column that I'm looking for. I'm looking for a Power Query column and an Excel column. So I need to break these training programs which are separated by commas into different rows. How do I do that? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to maybe go ahead and I'm going to say that I would like to split every single item of this particular list by a comma as a delimiter. So how do I do that? I'm going to say, hey, I have a function called list.transform. So list.transform and form F-O-R-M. And I'm going to say, hey, here is my list. This is nothing but my list and I want to pick every single item. That means each item I would want to pick and I want to delimit that with a comma. So I'm just going to say, hey, pick up each item and apply which function? Text.split function on every single item and the delimiter happens to be a comma. This is good. Press enter and let's just see what we get. Now, once the items were split and you got 2 items, those 2 items were returned in the form of another list. That means although you have 2 different rows for 2 different training programs, but they are kind of broken into 2 different, like in a list format. Now, all that I do is I just combine the values of all of these list items that I have, and I'm going to get a single list. So I'm just going to say that I would like to combine all of these lists that I have received, and that should actually do well. Press enter and all of the lists, smaller lists, they have been combined to give me one single list. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this particular query which contains the list and create a column for Power Query, create a column for Excel, create a column for trading, so on and so forth. Let's just see how can we do that using list.accumulate. All right, people, the fun begins here. List.accumulate. So we have made this training list and we have to now create columns for every single training program that is mentioned in this particular list. How do we do that? Using list.accumulate. I'm going to create a new step in here and start to call my function, which is nothing but list.accumulate. Now, as a first part of this particular function, list.accumulate, it's asking you that, hey, do you have a list in which you would like to do the iteration? That particular list is nothing but the names of these training programs that we have collected right here. So I'm just going to feed that right here. That means my list is training list is my list. All right. Then it says, hey, what's your seed or what's your starting point? Now, in our earlier cases, we have mentioned the starting point as 0. We have mentioned the starting point as a number or like a text or something or the other. Here, my starting point is nothing but a table. Now note that the thing that we are trying to do is nothing but adding a column, and adding a column could only be possible on a table. Now, on which table would we want to start adding a column? So this particular table, which is nothing but the source step, contains the 2 columns, and here is where I would like to start adding a column. So this entire source table becomes the seed. That means when you start doing your iteration, start by adding a column to this particular source table. So I'm just going to say that my seed is nothing but source. Okay. Then it says, hey, what's your accumulator? So I'm going to say that just like the way that we have to declare 2 variables, one is the state, the other one is the current. This time I'm going to name them differently. All right. So I'm just going to say that my 2 variables are, so this is my output table. Now remember this, because I'm writing this as the first, this is going to be my state. That means all the outputs of every single iteration are going to be stored in this output table, right? And this is going to give you a table as an output. And the second accumulator, or the second input, is going to be each training, or let's say training name. So training name, and that is going to be my current, right? And then it asks you, hey, what's your function? That means once I go through every single training name, what do you want to do? So what do I want to do? I want to add a column. So I'm just going to say that I would like to add a column. So table.add column happens to be my function that I'm going to use. Just as the way that we saw it in the example once we were doing some manual work, table.add column function is going to ask for 3 inputs. First input, hey, to which table are you trying to add a column, right? So I'm trying to add a column to whatever is the output. So output happens to be my table. So output table is the table on which the new column is going to be added. Then it says, hey, what should I name the column? Once a column has been added, what should I call that? So the name of the column is going to be nothing but the name of the item in the training list. And where does every single item get stored? In the current variable. Right now we are calling that current variable as nothing but the training name. So I'm just going to say that, hey, once you create a column, call that column as nothing but the training name. All right. Then it says, what should I put inside of that column? That means in that column that we are trying to create, what value do you want to see? So as of now, I just want to see 1 everywhere. So I'm just trying to make it work. Now, as soon as I kind of commit to this particular function, what do I get? I get a column added to the table right here. So initially this was my starting table. Then the first column was added. This became the input to the second step. Then another column was added, and that became the input to the third step. And then another column was added, so on and so forth, till the time it went through all the columns, all the values of this particular list, and added all of these columns to this particular table, all in just one step. Now the problem is that as of now, this is just giving you 1 as an input. It's not really giving you the true and false that we would ideally want. Now the next job is going to be to ideally convert the 1 into a true or a false. That's the ideal output that we're expecting. All right, the problem that we're trying to solve in order to get true and false is I'm trying to check that why don't you consider both of these items separately? That means Power Query is one training and Excel is another training. Consider them separate different words, and why don't you compare that with the header or not? If Power Query equals to the header, then you write true here. If Excel equals to the header, then you write true here. Otherwise, you can just keep writing false everywhere else. That's what I'm trying to do. Now, in order for me to be able to get that, I first need to break these items as 2 different items and not one single text string. Now, as of now, what I have done is here I'm writing 1. But instead of writing 1 here, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to capture these 2 items as 2 separate pieces of texts. Let's just do that. I'm going to say that I don't really want to write 1, and I want to split the text. I want to split this particular text by a delimiter, which is nothing but a comma and a space. So I'm just going to say, hey, I'm using a function .text.split, S-P-L-I-T. And I'm going to say, hey, the text is going to be kept in the column name called training. And the delimiter happens to be a comma and a space. Now let's just see what happens if I just maybe close the bracket right here and kind of commit to this function. I get a list. In that particular list, I have broken the 2 trainings that I had, which is nothing but Power Query and Excel. They are now 2 separate words. Now, the next obvious thing that I should be doing is that I should be taking this particular word and comparing that. Are you there in the header of the column or not? If you're there, that means you did attend the training, and I'd like to give you a true. Then here, once I go in this particular list, which is again nothing but Power Query and Excel, I'm going to say, hey, are you there in the header or not? If you're there in the header, then I'm just going to maybe give you not a false, but actually a true. How do we do such a thing? I'm going to say that in this list, if any of these items of the list, does it match the header or not? How do I write such a thing? I'm going to write a function called list.matchesAny. All right. Now the list.matchesAny function is asking you, hey, do you have a list in which you'd like to run some match the following kind of thing? Yes, we have this particular list, which is where we would like to match. What am I trying to match in this particular list? I'm going to say that, hey, every single item of this list, which is Power Query, Excel, and all the training programs, each item of this particular list, is it matching with the header? Now, the problem is, how do I capture the header of the column? Now, remember that how did we place the header in the first place? The header was nothing but every single training program that was mentioned in this particular query, which is right here, this particular query. So that particular name of the program came from the current variable. In our case, the current variable is nothing but the training name. So I'm just going to say that, hey, every single item of the list, is that equal to the training name or not? So I'm just going to maybe write training name right here. And I think that should be good. I just have to close one more bracket and commit to this, press enter, and voila. Take a look. We have Power Query and Excel. Power Query matches here, it gives me a true. Excel matches here, that gives me a true. And rest everything else happens to be a false. This is absolutely gorgeous. All right, that was all about List.Accumulate. I hope I was able to help you understand and make you navigate through List.Accumulate through various complexities of the problems that we discussed right here. Although this particular problem need not be solved through List.Accumulate, there are several simpler ways of solving it. You should take a look at the blog comments and the answers that people have replied, and you should actually learn from those solutions as well. I was trying to particularly use this example as a good candidate to describe the nuances of List.Accumulate and probably describe a few practical examples through this one. I hope you enjoyed this one. And in case you did participate in the challenge, a big shout out to you. Thank you so much for taking out the time and participating in this challenge. All right. In the end, I'd like to give a big shout about my DAX and my Power Query courses in case you're starting out with Power BI and you'd like to learn the fundamentals first and then proceed on to solving more challenging, more difficult problems of your own data, be it DAX, data modeling, or Power Query. I highly recommend that you take a look at my courses. It's going to be super awesome. Thanks so much for sticking around. Indeed, this was a very long one. If you have any questions, put them down in the comments and I will be glad to reply. Thanks so much, and I will catch you guys once again in the next one.